This video was first uploaded in September 2015, but Top 5s has come a long way since then, and I'd first like to thank you all for that. But we wanted to revisit the graveyards featured in that video, and update and improve their creepy stories. So here are 5 terrifying and haunted graveyards from around the world. Another video as part of our Creepy Marathon month. Hit those lights, sit back, and enjoy. Highgate Cemetery. There are very few graveyards in the world that can compete with the level of paranormal activity that Highgate Cemetery possesses. For many years, it's been the centre of some of the most spine-chilling legends out there. And it's not just ghosts that lurk around this place, it also has a resident vampire. The 30-acre cemetery lies in the heart of London and is the final resting place for some of the most well-known people in the world. It's like a who's who of the dead, and hosts an array of global important figures from politics, art and sport. And sadly, since the last video, George Michael has also been added to this list. The first burial took place there in 1839, and it's believed well over 160,000 bodies lie in its grounds. By the 1940s, with the onset of World War II, the cemetery started to decline, and by the 1960s, 53,000 graves had been abandoned and left to the elements. The neglect and decay took its toll, and graves started to crack and crumble as the roots of sprawling vegetation split the stone apart, leaving a creepy collection of crooked and cracked gravestones standing alongside grand Gothic tombs and mausoleums. Rumours started to circulate that the site was being used by sinister cults who were holding rituals in the grounds, and one report stated that the body of a woman was taken from a vault, staked through the heart and left lying in the middle of a path. Local newspapers also started to receive stories of ghostly encounters and paranormal activity, and it soon became a known paranormal hotspot. On one such occasion, a man broke down in his car next to the cemetery and claimed he saw a hideous-looking apparition with glowing eyes glaring at him through the rusted iron gates. Others reported seeing a dark shrouded figure standing on the path, gazing pensively into space, seemingly oblivious to everything. But when approached, he vanished and reappeared a short distance away, adopting the same reflective pose. Another frequent sighting is that of the mad old woman, said to be the spirit of a mother who murdered her children and now spends her time running wildly among the monuments searching for their graves. But the scariest and most reported sighting in Highgate Cemetery is the vampire ghost. He is said to be around 7 feet tall, with piercing red eyes, wearing a long black coat and a tall hat. He is a frequent visitor to the cemetery, and to this day is still seen. The Highgate Vampire, as he has become known, was the inspiration for the Hammer horror film Dracula AD 1972. However, the activity is not restricted to inside the cemetery grounds, as outside, along Swains Lane, the road that borders the graveyard, there have been reports of people encountering a strange creature that scales the wall and jumps out in front of them. In the same vicinity, a ghostly cyclist has been spotted panting his way up to the steep incline of the lane, who then disappears when spotted. Others have witnessed a tall man in a top hat who strolls calmly across the road and then disappears into the wall of the cemetery. This sighting is always accompanied by a mournful tolling from the bells in the nearby disused chapel. In recent years, the cemetery has been restored, and visitors other than relatives of the dead either have to pay to enter or join a guided tour. If any of you have ever been there, I would love to hear about your experience in the comments. St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans. Considered by locals as one of the most haunted cemeteries in the world, St. Louis is the oldest and by far the creepiest cemetery in New Orleans, and paranormal activity has been reported there for hundreds of years. It first opened in 1789 and contains over 700 tombs and over 100,000 bodies, and is still an active gravesite. But for over 200 years, it's been plagued by the ghosts of its residents, and the eerie quiet atmosphere that descends over the crumbling cemetery has made it a magnet for paranormal enthusiasts, as well as film producers. Most notable films, such as Easy Rider and Interview with a Vampire, have been shot inside its grounds. The chaotic layout of the tombs and burial plots are hard to navigate, and many of the old tombs have either been vandalised or are crumbling with age. Some of the older graves also bear cryptic symbols. Over the years, visitors have reported hearing all manner of strange things, from weeping and groaning coming from inside the tombs, to an old man's face appearing on the side of one particular grave, which terrifies visitors as they walk by. But by far, the most famous ghost is that of Mary Laveau, who in life was a voodoo queen and one of the most feared voodoo practitioners in New Orleans history. Her ghost is recognisable by her red and white turban and brightly coloured clothes, and she has been seen walking through the tombs. People have also reported being scratched, pinched, or shoved down to the ground by her. Perhaps most interestingly of all is the practice of marking the tomb of Mary Laveau with 3 X's, while asking her for a favour or making a wish. Legend has it that if the wish is granted, the person is required to return and place a gift on her tomb. Unfortunately, this has led to lots of vandalism, presumably by those whose wish wasn't granted, resulting in the cemetery being closed to the public and only accessed through guided tours. Other ghosts include the spirit of Henry Vigna, a tragic story of a 19th century sailor who had no real home to speak of, and who spent most of his time at sea. But eventually he settled in a boarding house in New Orleans. And when he was away, he asked his landlord to look after some important documents for him. That included details of the family tombs. But when he returned, his landlord had sold the tomb, and when he died a short time after, he had to be buried in the paupers section of St. Louis Cemetery. It's said Henry has haunted the place ever since, wandering the grounds, asking visitors if they know where his tomb is located. Allegedly, Henry's ghost has even turned up to funerals, appearing behind the grieving relatives to ask if there might be any more room in the tomb for him. His apparition has been caught on camera, and so has the distinct sound of a male's voice on an EVP, proclaiming to hear, "I need to rest." However, one of the scariest stories about St. Louis is that of a taxi driver who apparently picked up a lady who was stood outside of the front gate. She gave him the address of a house, and when they arrived, she asked him if he could knock on the door and get the man inside to also jump in the taxi. When he knocked, the man had no idea what was going on, but when the taxi driver described the woman, the man was shocked and said that it was his wife who had been dead for years and was buried in St. Louis. When they both went back to the car, the woman had vanished. It's said that after the incident, many taxi drivers will no longer pick people up from outside the graveyard. The cemetery has so many legends and ghost stories associated with it. It's become one of the most well-known haunted graveyards around, and allegedly, even Nicolas Cage has reserved a pyramid tomb for himself there. Old Jewish Cemetery in Prague. It is said that Prague has the most ghosts per square kilometre than any other place in Europe, so it's not surprising that the 15th century Old Jewish Cemetery located there has its fair share of paranormal encounters. And despite not having a resident ghost like the others on this list, it's quite possibly the creepiest cemetery of them all. The number of people buried there cannot be measured, as the graves have been layered up over hundreds of years, and in places are up to 11 layers deep. So although there are only 12,000 visible tombstones, it's possible that there are over 100,000 people buried there, piled on top of each other. The reason for this is that during the 3 centuries in which the cemetery was in active use, it constantly struggled with a lack of space, and due to the loyalty and respect the Jewish people had for their deceased ancestors, they did not allow old graves to be abolished. So instead of removing original gravestones, extra layers of soil were brought in to cover them, and new graves were placed on top of them. The cemetery is thought to be teeming with paranormal activity, with many reports of apparitions seen squeezing through the jam-packed tombstones. Close by is the picturesque Charles Bridge, which was once the site of some gruesome executions, and it's alleged the ghosts of the men who died there also haunt the area. Just taking a look at the mangled graves piled up on top of each other, and you can't imagine being there alone at night. Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. It's believed that over 1.5 million people are buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in Ireland, and the graveyard is the resting place for many famous political figures and revolutionaries. The cemetery is bound by high walls with watchtowers that were built to protect the dead from the epidemic of grave robbing in the early 19th century. At the time, Dublin's anatomy school and the Royal College of Surgeons required vast numbers of bodies for dissection, and an adult body was worth at least £2, while a child's body was sold by the inch. This created a lucrative business for the less discerning of Dublin's entrepreneurs of the time. Thankfully, public outrage eventually forced legislators to pass the British 1832 Anatomy Act, which provided anatomists with a legal source of corpses, and grave robbing quickly declined. Unlike some of the other cemeteries on this list, Glasnevin is not run down or decaying, and the graves and grounds are lovingly tended. But what makes this graveyard so spooky is the sheer amount of graves that are there, and the thought that some of them may be empty. Over the years, the cemetery has had its fair share of paranormal activity, but probably its most famous ghost is a black dog. He belonged to Coast Guard Captain Neil Boyd, who drowned during a heroic rescue mission in February 1861. Boyd and his crew had fought hard to save a group of sailors clinging to the rocks, but were swept away by a giant wave. When rescuers went searching for the lost crew, the only living thing they found was the captain's dog, a black Newfoundland hound, who was still sitting in the lifeboat. After Captain Boyd's body was recovered, he was to be buried at Glasnevin, but throughout the Requiem Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral and the funeral procession to the graveyard, the captain's dog remained close to his master's coffin, and after the burial, the animal lay down on his master's grave, refusing to move, eat or drink, and eventually died of starvation. Many times since then, a black Newfoundland dog has been seen wandering the paths of the cemetery, pining for his dead master. Other sightings have included glowing figures and the sound of children singing when there are no children around. The macabre past of the cemetery has resulted in visitors being invited on grave-digging tours, and there's even a dedicated ghastly Glasnevin exhibition on display in a nearby museum. I'd love to know if any of you have ever been to this graveyard. The Catacombs of Paris. Walking through the streets of Paris, it's hard to imagine that just 20 meters below you are the bones of approximately 6 million people. In the 18th century, the overflowing graveyards of Paris were becoming a health risk, and the government needed a fast solution to get rid of the corpses that were piling up. So they came up with the idea of putting them under the streets of Paris. In the maze of pitch-black underground galleys and tunnels are the bones and skulls of the dead, piled up against the walls like some sort of macabre decorative mural. So it's no surprise that with that amount of dead people concentrated and exposed in one area, the Paris catacombs are France's most haunted location. Today, only 10% of the catacombs is open to the public, and those that have visited claim to have seen shadowy figures, orbs, and unexplained lights. But there are always those that want more, and they have discovered secret tunnels all over Paris where they can illegally access the restricted areas. These urban explorers are known as cataphiles, and many of them get lost while venturing deep into the underground tunnels, before eventually finding their way out. However, in the early 1990s, a man decided to venture down the catacombs to explore one of the restricted areas. He went alone, accompanied only by his camcorder, and as he walked deeper and deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels full of bones and skulls, he filmed every step of the way until he realised he was lost and started to panic. What happened to the man is a mystery, but the footage he took on his camera was found some years later. When it was played back, it appeared to show the last disturbing minutes of the man before he vanished into the pitch-black tunnels. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, especially if you watched our previous video, but it's still pretty creepy. Take a look.
These arrows point in a direction. Occasionally also, he stops to photograph roomfuls of bones, which means that he's very, very deep inside the catacombs. So basically, he's filming what he's seeing very deep inside the catacombs, other than the point of view shots or pictures of human bones. The catacombs for centuries. So it is possible with these paintings that we may be able to retrace his itinerary to some extent. After about We hear his breathing get louder and louder, as though something was scaring him. He's frightened, he's frightened. Occasionally he stops, perhaps to try to decide which way to run among all the many different corridors. He's running faster and faster and faster, deeper and deeper into the catacombs. And all of a sudden, we hear his breathing get louder and louder, as though something was scaring him. He's frightened, he's frightened. Occasionally he stops, perhaps to try to decide which way to run among all the many different corridors. He's running faster and faster and faster, deeper and deeper into the catacombs. And all of a sudden,
it's unsure whether it's a hoax, but many cataphiles believe it is genuine, and that the man lost his way and died down there, and his spirit remains running the tunnels for all eternity trying to find his way out. Hoax or not, the footage is terrifying and gives you an idea of what it would be like to be lost by yourself in those dark tombs. In 2017, that is exactly what happened to a 16 and 17-year-old who found themselves lost in the restricted area of the catacombs. They spent 3 horrifying days down there until they were found by rescue dogs. Luckily for the two, they made a full recovery after being treated for hypothermia. If either of the 2 people who got lost down there are watching this video, then I would love to hear your story. So that's 5 of the creepiest and believed haunted graveyards in the world. I hope you've enjoyed, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.